Hello, everybody, and welcome to Punch Kick Choke Chat. I'm here with Sensei Suino, and we are today going to be talking. It's a micro episode, and we're going to be talking about Yamaguchi Sensei. And as a bit of an introduction for Yamaguchi Sensei, I want to say that whether he knew it or not, he's the reason why I train with Sensei Suino today. He's the reason why my students are doing Mukuso Jigiden Ishinryu iaido. And I often think when he's in heaven, if he looks down and just shakes his head and says like, oh, when I started this, I didn't realize this, all these people would be doing this now. And that's because Sensei Legacy once went to a seminar in Toronto where Yamaguchi Sensei was there and went to his session first. And it was one of those things where you had to traverse around to different, I think Sato Sensei was there and Kai Sensei was there and different other EMAF instructors were there. But Sensei Legacy didn't want to leave Yamaguchi Sensei's mat. So at the end, when you were supposed to change, he'd say to Yamaguchi Sensei, I'd really like to just stay on your mat. Is that okay? And Sensei Legacy said, Yamaguchi would say, yeah, it's fine. And then he'd stay, and then he just stayed with him for the entire seminar. And at the end, Sensei Legacy wanted to do iaido and asked Yamaguchi Sensei who he should train with in North America. And Yamaguchi Sensei said, my best student, Suino Sensei, is coming back from Japan and you should train with him, and the rest is history. Okay, but so Sensei Suino, let's start off by just asking, when did you first meet Yamaguchi Sensei? Or that's I think where we should start.
Sounds great. I first met him in Las Vegas at an EMAF seminar. I think it was in 87, the summer of 87 or 88. Probably 87, because I moved to Japan in August of 88. And so it was the EMAF crew, some of the same gentlemen you referenced, plus some other really well-known people, 2 generations of Otsuka senseis who are the founders of Wadoryu Karate, among other things. So it was just a big event in Vegas, hotter than hell. And it was the same thing you described, bunch of different mats with a bunch of different instructors. I knew Yamaguchi Sensei was going to be there. I had heard great things about him from a lot of other teachers. And the very first time I actually ever saw him, I hadn't trained with him yet. I was going back to my room and walking past one of the casino areas of the hotel where we were staying. And I saw him walking in the other direction. And it was bizarre because Yamaguchi Sensei, it sounds like he's putting on airs, but he floated. He never put his heels down when he walked. And that's because he had whatever it was, 50 years of kendo and iaido. His calves, as anybody trained with him knew, were the size of watermelons. And he wasn't a big man. So he was just so strong in his legs. So he floated, he had a cocktail in his hand and he just floated through the, probably a cigarette too, floated through the casino. And I went, holy cow, that's cool. I've never seen anybody move that way. And then, the next day when festivities started, I went to his seminar and I did not quite the same thing that Legacy Sensei did, but I did go to several of his sessions and only a few of the other ones. And while I was there, I said, hey, I'm thinking about going to Japan. Sensei, I would love to train with you if that's possible. And he looked at me and kind of went, this is so typical of him. He just went, and didn't say anything else. I'm like, I don't know what that reaction meant, but, he just was basically waiting to see if I followed through on what I did. But that's how I met him. And I was blown away. I learned like 5 waza from him and I practiced them like crazy. Of course, terribly, because, you can't learn something well in, 3 hours on a weekend. But happily, I was able to get in and train with him once I moved to Tokyo.
Yeah, one thing I want to mention is that Legacy Sensei always said when he trained with him, one of the things that stood out to him was after, Hanshi Burkowski had organized that event and Hunchitarian, and they were at a big dinner after, and there was a bottle of Canadian Club whiskey. And I guess Yamaguchi Sensei had an affinity for that and he enjoyed it. And I guess Sensei Legacy said that he reached over to grab this bottle and And Sensei Lacey looked down and his pants came up and he said he had one of those, his calves were so big that he had like a garter around his knee with little suspenders onto his socks so that his socks wouldn't fall down. And he said to me, Randy, his calves were giant. They were big and veiny, and he looked like a teenage mutant ninja turtle. That's what he said his calves looked like. So that's and I sadly didn't go to that seminar, and I regret it to this day that I didn't go to that seminar. So you get to Japan then, Sensei Suino, and how do you start training with him? Like, you're going there, you don't know any iaido, you're doing Nihon Jiu-Jitsu and you're doing judo. How do you finally get to Yamaguchi Sensei, and what was that first interaction like?
Yeah, well, I went and I had a letter of introduction to Sato Shizuya Sensei, who was one of the co-founders of IMA and ran the American Embassy Judo and Jiu-Jitsu Club. So my good friend John Gage was training there already. So I went there like the first Saturday when I was there. I went to downtown Tokyo and went to that club, and we trained. And Sato Sensei was really happy to see that I had proficiency, because a lot of people came into that club with no experience at all. So afterwards he said, "Oh, your judo's pretty good. You got good ukemi. You going to train regularly?" And I said, "Oh, absolutely. I'll be here at least 2 days a week." And then I said, "And by the way, I really want to train with Yamaguchi Sensei. Can I do that?" And he, just typical Japanese thing, he just goes, "Oh, too soon." Okay. And what that ended up meaning is he just wanted me to prove myself, that I had good intentions, that I was a hard worker, that I wouldn't embarrass him. And so basically every Saturday I asked him, "I want to train with Yamaguchi Sensei. Can you set it up?" I asked him. And a couple of months later, he finally relented and said, "Okay, I'll set up the introduction." And so he made the call, and he said, "Okay, on Thursday, here's the address. Go see Yamaguchi Sensei." So that was cool and a little intimidating, because, I'm still really new in Tokyo. I didn't know my way around that much. And so I had to navigate my way there. And this is pre-Google Maps or any other help like that.
And that was at his home, right?
Yeah.
His dojo.
Yeah, he had a dojo in his house. He had a regular Japanese house with a courtyard. And then the front part of the house, it was like an extension was built. And I don't know how big it was, maybe 20 feet long and 16 feet wide, and it had a wooden floor and a 12-foot ceiling. And some big, like a sliding door and some big windows so you get air in there. And basically it was one person doing a form at a time. It was big enough for that.
But that also goes to show how much he loved iaido, right? That he would actually take his home, build something like that, and not just for himself, but to train people like you and others who would come to train with him, right? Like it was an all-day affair for him, right? Like just iaido, like 6 hours a day, every day, like.
Oh, it's crazy. So, that's where he taught his private students. And his wife called him what she said, iaido mushi, which means like fanatic, right? He was an iaido fanatic. And she told me that he most often had 2 students a day, plus he practiced on his own for about 3 hours. So our workouts were roughly 3 hours long. And so that would mean if he wasn't doing kendo that day, he was doing 9 hours of iaido on a regular day. And it's not like, it's not like you're lifting kettlebells and running, right? It's do a form. He would do a form and then sit down and watch me do a form, and then he would comment on it, and either I did it again or I would sit down, he would do it. So it's a lower intensity workout, but as anyone knows who's done iaido, it's much harder than it looks. But the mental challenge of staying in space for 3 hours and listening to instructions and dialing it in and having no other distractions except maybe the sound of locusts in the summer. It's a pretty intense experience.
Sounds so romantic. It sounds like everything that every Westerner would want to experience when they were in Japan, that you had that experience. Like every Westerner would want to go to Japan. Sounds like a Kill Bill scene, right? Like every Westerner would want to go there, listen to the locusts with the sliding doors, with the sword master to learn this art.
And it's so funny you say that, because I was head over heels like that. Even the first day, even though there was so much coming at me, right? New uniforms and new stuff, meeting people, taking pictures of my first visit and all that. I was just like you said, I was like, fuck yeah, this is the coolest thing ever, right?
Yeah, I'm happy for you and jealous of you, Sensei, both often
Right.
with many different topics.
Right.
Um,
Crazy.
so when you were there, when you were there, maybe we could just set the record once and for all. You competed often in iaido tournaments. Every year that you were there, you competed. I don't know if you competed outside of the Tokyo Championships. I think you did a few times. But the question would be, can you just set the record straight? You know, I think you were the first Westerner to go and win these things, but what did you win? And then also the follow-up question would be, how did Yamaguchi Sensei prepare you for those types of events? Like, did the training change at all? Like, what did he do different?
Right. Right. So I won 4 major championships. So Kanto is the prefecture, right? So Tokyo's the city, Kanto is the prefecture, like a province in Canada or a state in the United States.
Okay.
And so the competitions, they would do like little Tokyo ones or whatever, but then all the best people would come together in that. So like if everybody in Michigan came together to do football, or everybody in Ontario came to do hockey, everybody in Kanto came together to do iaido. And those were 300 or 400 person events. And I won that 4 years in a row at my rank level. So it's not like I beat everybody. I just, like, if I was competing at Nidan, I beat everybody at Nidan. If I beat it right at Sandan. And the first 3 were one association. And then the last one was a little bit different association. I don't remember exactly how to describe it, but they were all prefectural champions. Sometimes I just loosely say all Tokyo, but it really was all Kanto. So that was 4 times. And then I had a couple of other notable successes. Like when I did my first Dan rank test, I tested for Shodan. They promoted me to Nidan. That's the time I took the written exam entirely in Japanese, and I didn't hurt my cred, right? Studied my ass off for like 3 months, and I passed that exam entirely in Japanese. And then the final kudo was a month or so before I moved back to the States. Yamaguchi Sensei took me to the Soke's house in Kyoto, and I tested in front of him, and that was just the Soke, Fuitorao, Soke, Yamaguchi Sensei, and me. And that was like a 5-hour experience where we did iaido together. I did iaido under pressure of testing, and we sat down afterwards and they talked a bunch of politics. And that was really interesting because the Soke didn't realize that I understood what they were talking about. So I got some information at that time I probably shouldn't have had. And I got double promoted there. So I think I was Yondan at the time, and he gave me a 6th Dan certificate. If I'm remembering this right, he gave me a 6th Dan certificate after that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I know, like, a lot of Westerners right now are probably cringing. Oh, what do you mean you didn't follow this path? And to any of you right now who are sweating and you're like, oh, listen, it doesn't matter, because Setsuno's been doing iaido now for over 50 years, so it all comes out in the wash. whatever you think about the path to mastery, you just got to get to mastery. And Suino's definitely a master of the sword. And
Well,
many others.
listen, yeah, fair enough. I'm lucky I had some talent in that. I had the best instructor in the world in the last 100 years, as far as I'm concerned. But everybody's got to remember, I worked my ass off. Like we just talked about, Yamaguchi Sensei trained 9 hours a day, and I was doing a bunch of martial arts. But unless I had a dislocated shoulder or something, I was doing iaido at least 3 hours a day by myself, in addition to my classes, my weekly classes with Yamaguchi Sensei. And as far as I know, nobody was working like that, right? I was working my ass off, and all the people, like my team members on the team, like the all Kanto team that went to Kyoto to the nationals, most of those guys trained once a week. They were good. They were talented people. Some of them were very good. I don't know that I've ever worked more concentratedly on any activity. I put more of myself into that than I've ever done for 4 years running. So that, be that as it may, it was, I had some blessings, and I also worked my ass off. But you asked a 2-part question. One part was, what were the achievements, and what was the other part?
The other part, Sensei, was how did he change the type of training at all? Like when it was time to come to the tournament and getting you ready for the tournament, what was his approach to that? clearly if he was entering you in tournaments, he thought you could win and he wanted you to win. So there must have been some change in the training regime.
A little bit. There were two major changes and then one other, which I'll explain. So one change was that he would develop a set. Like if it was a test and they said, okay, you're going to do 7 forms in front of the judges, and we would develop a set, right? Instead of, because a normal practice of 3 hours would be start at the most basic waza and work all the way through the set. And if I hadn't learned something yet, he'd teach me 1 or 2 more. Like that was just the basic workout. But for, depending on the tournament and how important it was, between 1 and 3 months ahead of time, he would say, okay, what's your set? And I would say, oh, let me do this, this, and this. And, he would kind of look at me like, oh, that's harebrained idea. Let's do this. And always give me simpler forms than I thought I wanted to do, which I accepted, of course. And then in addition to the regular sequential training, we'd go through that set. The closer we got to the tournament, the more often I would just walk in, get my stuff on, he'd go, do your set, right? And I might do it once, twice, 3 times. Then we'd go through regular training. And then at the end, okay, do your set once, twice, 3 times. And at home, I was training differently too. I wasn't going through the whole thing. I was doing my set, doing my set, doing my set, sometimes 50 times a day, right? So that's part one. The other part was Yamaguchi Sensei had a direct lineage, and our regular daily training was on that direct lineage. He would teach me the techniques the way his teacher, Ota Tsugiyoshi Sensei, taught him, right? But that didn't always comport with what All Japan Iaido Federation was doing with their techniques. So when we got closer to tournaments, he would say, oh, I know we always do this, but listen, you're going to be scored this way on this tournament. So make this adjustment, this tweak here. And really, besides a really intense practice, the only other thing was before the national tournament that I went to in my last few months of being in Japan. He took me to these training settings where there were other really high-ranking instructors and let them look at my stuff and make a couple of corrections, just to make sure that those are guys like on the judging panel and whatever. So we were dialed right into what they were looking for.
Yeah, and they got to see you beforehand.
Well, that didn't hurt me. I don't know if, listen, I tell my own students this: who you train with matters, not only for how your martial arts are, but when you walk in the room with somebody and the room has an opinion of that person, it's going to affect your tournament outcome. So it didn't hurt that I had one of the most respected iaido teachers in all of Kanto in my corner.
Yeah. What about that little stick? I'm lucky enough to have been in your house and looked at pictures, and I've seen the infamous stick, you on your knees and him. What about that little stick?
So a shinai, which is what kendo people use to whack each other on the head, is composed of a bunch of different bamboo pieces, right? And every now and then when they get old, they take them apart and you got this bamboo left over. And if it's shredded or whatever, you don't want to keep it because it's got really a lot of points and it'll tear you up. But he had a very nice one, separated, and there was like a mantra, like a Buddhist mantra written on it in ink. And that was his adjustment stick. And it didn't hit you with it. He would just use it to point things out. But one of the things I always talk about is the fact that when you stand up in the middle of an iaido form, you never stand with your legs straight. You always want a little bit of a knee bend with your toes out so your center of gravity is lower. And he would take that stick and kind of go between the knees and tap between them just to make sure, right? Or just rest it on you, like to make your shoulder drop, just little things. So it was not the old-fashioned Buddhist, whack 'em stick. It was just a tool, and I never really understood what that Buddhist mantra meant, but it was cool as hell to have that in there.
Okay. You just made it even more romantic, right? Like now he's got the little shinai stick. Like it just keeps getting more and more.
Oh, you have no idea, man.
Wants it to be. So you lived in Japan for like 4 or 5 years, and then you went back a number of times. I've gone back with you. Hopefully we're going to go this year again. I'm super excited about that. And when we were coming home from Quebec, I asked you a question about the last time you trained with him. And I just think it's a really cool story. Like I've been thinking about it every day since we got home. Like just 1, how proud he must have been, and 2, how proud you must have been. and 3, how the other students must have been affected by it. And I just think it's really cool if you could just tell that story quickly for everybody who would listen to this tomorrow or in 10 years.
Yeah. I told you that story. I think it was 95 when I went back. I left. I came back to the States in 92. As you say, I've been back a number of times. I think it was 95. I didn't go back for a while because shortly after I left, he was diagnosed with stomach cancer. And the treatment over there, besides chemo and whatever else, is they basically remove your stomach and they take your esophagus and sew it onto the, whatever that's called, where your beginning of your intestines is. And you have to eat. You're not hungry, but you have to eat and gradually make that area bigger. It's like you're recreating your stomach. So after whatever, a year and a half of treatments and this, he was a shadow of his former self. He was skeletal. He was so skinny. But he had just gotten back into practice a little bit. I heard through the grapevine that he was doing a little bit of iaido. So I made some inquiries and I said, hey, I'd love to come back. And he said, yeah, we'll welcome you. We'll do some training. So I went back, and most of his involvement at that point was he'd come to the training sessions and sit and make a few comments, but he wasn't doing much active training at that point. But we went to this municipal center with a gym, a small gym, and he had, I can't remember, but a group of his students. And at some point he said, okay, Suino, show us how your iaido is, demonstrate your iaido. And so I did some forms, 5 forms or 7 forms or something. And as always, I was entirely devoted to my sensei, and I had been training my ass off, as I always have. And after I did my set, he just kind of sat there for a minute, and then he looked at the other guys in the room and he said, see, like, that's how it's supposed to be done, which was very gratifying and a little intimidating. I didn't want them to be mad at me, but I was then, and I'm, as far as I know to this day, I was the most successful, most decorated student of his. I don't necessarily think I was the best. He had some really good students, and somewhere around here I have some video of them, which I'd love to show you at some point. But I was the most decorated. Had the most success in competition, and he was very proud of me, which I love. Of course, I was head over heels about him, still am. And I got along really well with most of his students. So it was a great environment.
So you've always described him to me, and I've always, the words that kind of come to mind outside of like skilled swordsman, like devoted, hard trainer, dedicated, disciplined, tranquil, peaceful, and when we were talking this last weekend, I said, he seems to me to be a person who had very little insecurities. When I make those comments, what do you, and I think that came out in demos, like you've described how he was in demos and these big demos. Could you kind of either pile on that or describe that a little bit?
Yeah. He's one of the first men I met who lived out his best self. We meet a lot of people in lives who are living through their issues, right? Maybe they're alcoholics, they're insecure, or if they're successful, they have some aspect of their life that they struggle with. He was just sort of like Buddha, like he was just here now. He was who he was. He didn't try to make more of it. When I joke about how matter of fact he is, when I was going off on some harebrained idea, he would just say, he was just steady. He was just steady. Now, maybe he wasn't always like that, but I met him in his mid to late 60s. And he was calm. It was calming to be around him. He was relentless, but steadfast, right? Train. The solution to everything was, let's train. And yet he wasn't a big human being, right? He was maybe 5'4" at the most. He probably weighed more than a normal person of that height because of the size of his forearms and his calves. But when he had this radiant energy that was kind of tamped down during, at his house. But when he would be in the front of a room demonstrating iaido, he could shut the room down. It's just hard to explain unless you've experienced it. He's just fascinating to watch. we talk about this in our iaido practice, right? Your presence, right? The gravity or your presence. When people first learn, they're very internal, their head tends to be down, they do their form, and all their energy feels like it's in this tiny little spot right in front of them, and they don't express it. There's no energy radiating out of them. And as people get better, their head's up and they look a little bit farther away, and they don't have to think about the details, but they're working through the forms more. As they rise, their presence, right, their energy expands and they take up more of the room. And people have said to me that I can kind of do that in at the dojo or whatever. I think Yamaguchi Sensei could have done that in a stadium. It was remarkable. I don't really know how it works. I just know I experienced it a number of times.
Yeah, you kind of said before that people kind of get bored at those things, but when he stepped onto the floor, usually like the whole room just kind of shut down, right? Like,
yeah, well, like a grading, you go to a grading over there and everybody has to demonstrate. And if there's 400 people there, even if they do 5 at a time, you're going all the way through the people that have no rank yet, all the way up to the 8th dans or 9th dans. Right. So by the time somebody like Yamaguchi Sensei demonstrates, people have been there 8 hours and they're fussing around, changing their uniforms, watching the people, going over to the vending machine and getting green tea or whatever. And then when he started his form, man, he wouldn't get through the first waza and the place would just fall silent and everybody just stare at him. It was just remarkable.
that's so cool. Yeah, so cool. So you've referenced this that he learned his iaido from Ota Sensei. Did you ever get a chance to train with Ota Sensei, or how did he describe Ota Sensei? Like, did he have any comments about him, or was he long passed away by the time you were there, or like any details about their training relationship together?
I have to go back. I think Ota Sensei died in the 1970s. So, 10 or so years, 15 years before I went, at least. He did so Yamaguchi Sensei did kendo and iaido. Ota Sensei did judo and iaido. And that always put a smile on both our faces because he knew that I do judo and jujitsu and things. And so that was a nice connection. He described him as I almost described Yamaguchi Sensei in the sense that he was steadfast and kind. So, he's not a mean instructor. He was matter of fact. He said, let's train. And you can see, I think there's a picture around of him, like on my showmen that you've seen. And you can see he has that same just precise structure that Yamaguchi Sensei had. So clearly that's right. That's part of our tradition. And from what I've seen, it's more present in the Yamaguchi Sensei tradition than almost any Asian Ryu iaido tradition that I've seen outside of that.
We're rocking through these questions. I don't know how are we for time? What do we got left?
We have about 4 minutes left.
Okay, that's good. That's perfect. Because we're getting to that point now where it's I just like to open it up to you, and like, what should every human on the planet, whoever watches this podcast, know about Yamaguchi Sensei? Small details, big details. Did he like beer? Did he like coffee? Like, we know he trained 9 hours a day. Did he have kids? Did he have any other career other than, and what are some of the things like that people should really remember about him?
Yeah, well, definitely. I mean, he had a lovely wife. His wife was a master of tea ceremony, and that was something I got to enjoy from time to time. And just the two of them together were the kindest. It was so funny. You go over to their house and it was like going to grandma and grandpa's house. They were the nicest people. There was always, tea and cookies when I got there, or coffee and cookies. We'd train afterwards. We'd crack a beer and eat some peanuts. He had 2 kids. His son is in Germany now, still does iaido. His daughter, I believe, lives in San Francisco. I met her children. She had 2 daughters that used to come to spend the summers with grandma and grandpa. Yeah, he was a instructor at an agricultural college. Embarrassingly, I don't know exactly what he taught there because I wasn't that interested in what he did outside of iaido. But if you need to know something about Yamaguchi Sensei, I just think you need to know that I think sometimes people feel that if you're a really great martial artist or a really great martial arts teacher, that you somehow have to be mean or harebrained, and maybe that works for some people. But again, I mean, the reason I think he had such a deep impact on me was his kindness, his steadfastness, his presence in the moment, just somebody that was living out his best self every day, at least when I experienced him. Who knows what, I've got to assume his relationships with other people were equally amazing, and not living into his issues. He wasn't cruel to anybody. I never heard him say a harsh word to anyone. And I also never heard him even consider the idea that he would ever not do iaido and kendo. Like, this is who I am, this is what I do it every day. He was a calligrapher too. He had a high Dan rank in calligraphy. And I have a couple of examples of his stuff. Same steadfast approach. Train every day, get better over time. Be nice to other people, teach. And he was kind about things like money. I was young and stupid. I had a good income when I lived in Japan, but I didn't always manage it well. So sometimes I'd pay my dues a week late or 2 weeks late. Never said a word. In fact, he discounted my rate when I first got there because I wasn't making much money at first. So kind in that realm, generous to a fault. If I need to take a shower there. In fact, one of my teaching jobs was pretty close to his house. It was about a 30-minute walk, but a 5-minute drive. And so for the last year and a half I trained with him, on Thursday, if I was teaching that day, he would drive me over to this junior college where I was teaching. It's like, I tried everything I could to get him to stop, and he just wouldn't do it. So extraordinarily generous. You can see one of the things I'm saying, why somebody like that would leave an impression on you. They don't make them like that.
Yeah, of course. And I want to say to people that, since Suino talks about his instructor, and it's the lineage, and I'm really blessed to train with you, Sensei. Like I all those things that you see in your teacher, I see in you, and I get the benefit of that. And I'll probably butcher this story, but you told me the first time Yamaguchi Sensei gave you a sword, if you don't do iaido, when you first get your sword, the sagyo is tied very ornate, and then you got to kind of untie it, and then you got to tie a knot in it. And when you got your sword, you untied that knot, and then the next time you came back, somehow you had figured out how to tie that back. That's the level of detail that Sensei Suino gives to his iaido. And I think you said that Yamaguchi very matter-of-factly said, "Who did this?" And you said, "I did it." And he said, "Don't do that anymore."
Right.
Like, don't do that anymore. Yeah. And I want to say that I've watched you do iaido, and for me, I can recognize things because I've been in martial arts long enough. And when I watch you train, Sensei, and I just see you do certain things, and sometimes it's Junto Sono Ich or Mai or something, it's just, to me, the level of detail and how you've integrated that into yourself, you as a human being, like, it's not an act, it's part of who you are. It's incredible to watch. And if people never see it, they should see it, because it's incredible and beautiful and deadly all at once.
Yeah. And I just thank you, by the way, for making this happen and asking really good questions. This emotionally, right, is where the spirit of somebody lives on, right? Being able to share these ideas with you, and knowing that you've experienced the training itself, the waza, but also the culture around Yamaguchi Sensei's life. This is how we live through our martial arts, right? This is why we're perpetuating these stories, to help keep him alive. And he lives through me. As you said, I'm half of who I am is because of that 4 years I spent at Yamaguchi Sensei's dojo.
Outstanding. So I think we're done, Sensei. So I know we're going to do another podcast tonight, episode 100. What do you want to tell everybody about what we've been doing with Punch Kick Choke Chat and where we're going with it?
Well, as Randy said, tonight is a really big deal for us. We're doing the 100th episode of Punch Kick Choke Chat. We started back in the COVID era, and tonight the World Health Organization is officially calling the pandemic over. So it's pretty auspicious. We have so many good shows. We've had great people on. We've learned as we've gone. I think we got better at what we did. We've asked people better questions. We were able to connect with them. We've made so many friends, and I know we have a ton of folks that have watched our shows and have really appreciated learning more about martial arts, connecting with these people, some of whom sadly have passed away. And so now oftentimes our conversations are the last record of them talking in public, which is really an honor and a privilege. So if you're watching this, don't forget to check out our Facebook. Check us. We got a YouTube channel with all our videos on it. The fastest and quickest way to find all that is to go to punchkickchokechat.com. You can find everything there, previous episodes, background information, and everything you need. And we'd be grateful if you'd, hit that subscribe, like and share, make a few comments, and most importantly of all, join us for some of the live episodes. We'd love seeing your names on there. And oftentimes, depending on the episode, we'll ask people to jump in with questions and things, and it makes the conversations better.
Thanks, Sensei. Thanks for your time. It's been great. Time always flies when we're chatting.
100%.